What's up everybody, I'm Derek, this is Rocking E Forge, and today I thought I would do a video testing tongs that I got on Amazon. Now, I do have 4 different styles of tongs here, so this isn't going to be a comparison video. I just wanted to use each of these pairs of tongs and give you what I like about them, what I don't like about them, and whether or not I think they are worth the price that you can find them for on Amazon. So without any further ado, let's get to testing these tongs and let's get rocking. Alright, so the first pair of tongs that I'm going to review from Amazon are the Bonbo 17-inch V-bit bolt knife making tongs, bladesmith anvil forge tongs, assembled wolf jaw tongs, Amazon's choice in cooking tongs by Bonbo, on sale for $28.99. Let's try them out. Excuse me, while I switch the propane tank out for the forge, apparently I am completely out of propane on this tank. Alrighty, while the forge is heating up, I figured I would start by showing you the intent of these tongs. Now these tongs have a bolt jaw style V-bit jawed tong, which are best suited for holding things with a head like a railroad spike. Now V-bit jaws tend to be really good at holding square stock. They're also very good at holding round stock. As a result, as you perhaps can tell, this pair of tongs actually holds square stock at a 45-degree angle. And that is going to be common with any V-bit or square bit jawed tongs, so not a big issue there, but it is going to require a bit of an adjustment if you are used to forging square in line with your tongs. Now, one issue that I've already identified with these tongs, which kind of happens with every pair of bolt jaw tongs, so I'm not going to specifically hold it against them, is how much real estate the jaws actually take up on the piece of steel that you're forging. Now, I'm going to be turning this railroad spike into a barbecue fork, and as such, I want to be able to thin down this whole portion of what is going to become the handle. And because of how long these jaws are, I would have to turn these around, not a huge deal, turn these around and forge a reverse taper on the near edge of the anvil to make the handle slightly thinner. Now again, that's not a huge deal, but there are tongs that are specifically suited for forging on railroad spikes specifically, which will be number 2 on this list coming up. Now the immediate things that I notice on these tongs are the jaws are slightly not perfectly aligned. They do have a bit of a natural misalignment. That doesn't, affect the actual function of these tongs. They still grip things totally fine. And everything operates very smoothly, which is very nice. I will say a feature that I do like and something I might try on future tongs that I make is that the reins have an angled transition into the boss, which means the reins are perfectly in line up and down, as opposed to many pairs of tongs that have an offset, which is fairly normal. Now, I wouldn't say that these are any more or less comfortable, but if you like things to kind of have a nice symmetry to them, it is an interesting benefit. Now, something I don't necessarily like about these is the fact that it looks like, and probably rightfully so, that they were machine made. There's some rough spots here at the ends of the reins that, honestly, now that I look at them, make them look like these were a threaded rod at one point, which is really interesting to me. I'm not sure why a company machine making tongs would make them out of threaded rods, but it almost looks like these ball ends or cylindrical ends to the reins were actually just hex nuts threaded on and then tack welded together to make kind of an end to these tongs. Totally unnecessary, and it just kind of makes them look a little less professional, which is unfortunate. An additional thing that I immediately noticed, and it was something that I found on a different pair of tongs and replaced, is that the rivet has this weird kind of look to it that makes it seem like maybe the rivet itself was a tube and it had some sort of plug punched into it. I don't know how to describe it other than that. It doesn't affect the actual operation of the tongs at all. And as a result, for the money so far, I'm honestly pretty impressed. But the true test of a pair of tongs is how they feel when you are actually working steel. So, without any further ado, let's get the railroad spike in the forge and let's get to hammering on it. Now, one thing I will say, one thing I don't like about these so far is that if you don't get it perfectly in line with the tong jaws, you don't get the greatest grip on these. Now this is a problem only because it's a railroad spike, but all in all, so far really smooth operation. Now ignore that awkwardness of trying to pick this thing up out of the forge itself. It's not a huge issue. These tongs are fairly comfortable. In the grand scheme of things, I'm not a huge fan of the kind of offset 45-degree angle that I have to hold everything with here. However, they don't do a bad job. It's kind of an inherent weakness of bolt jaw tongs that if you're working on something this short, that is shorter than the width of the face of your anvil, plus the jaw of the tongs themselves, that you can't get a piece flat because the tongs are in the way, so you kind of have to do a lot of angled strikes and stuff like that. But all in all, they feel pretty decent and hold up pretty nice. They're nice and tight. No issues with them thus far. Now, an added benefit to these tongs that might really just be specific to me is the fact that they are kind of a wolf jaw hybrid, so to speak. So they've got this nice little square notch in the jaws of the tongs to hold square stock sideways, and this just happened to perfectly fit the punch that I use for my touch marking, which means this would be a great touch marking pair of tongs for me so that I don't have to hold the touch mark with my gloved hand and don't run as much risk of burning myself, which is great. All in all, these are a great little pair of tongs, and if you can get them on sale from Amazon for $28.99, I would say absolutely go ahead and pick yourself up a pair. If you were looking for a pair of bolt jaw tongs that also act kind of like a pair of wolf jaw tongs, and if you're looking for a pair that is relatively inexpensive, these would be a great option for you. The link for these will be in the description below. I'm going to give this pair of tongs 3.75 stars out of 5. Now, this video is not actually focused on a project, so I'm not going to show you more forging with each of these pairs of tongs, just a simple rundown and a quick use of all of them. So let's get to the second pair of tongs that I'm reviewing in this video. Now, these are the next pair of tongs that I'm going to review, and these are the Yours Me Blackhead Railroad Spike Tongs for holding railroad spikes, RR Spike Head Tongs for making RR Spike knives for $44.99. Let's check them out. Now, the first thing that you're going to notice about these pairs of tongs is that they have a hand-forged finish pair of reins, and they don't look as much like the picture as perhaps you thought they would. That's because as soon as I got these in hand, I realized that the reins of these tongs were 1/2 by 1/4 inch flat stock and weren't very comfortable and just kind of ugly in general. They looked like they had just been stamped out of a piece of steel and riveted together and mailed off. So, as it is apparent, I have already used these tongs fairly extensively actually, but when I first bought them, one of the first things I did was grind out and then punch out the rivet, separate the two parts of the tongs, and then forge out the reins to make them look a little less clunky and obnoxious and give them kind of my signature forged texture look that I like for my tong reins. Now, the jaws on these tongs are specific for holding railroad spikes and as such are really not suited to holding really anything else. However, what they are really good at is giving you a lot of real estate for hammering on a railroad spike nearly all the way up to the head itself. And I think that's where a pair of tongs like this really shines if you are working with railroad spikes a lot. Now, unfortunately, because of the way that these hold the railroad spikes, if you have the tongs meet at the end, you don't have necessarily the greatest grip on the head, and really that would just be me needing to adjust my tong reins. Wouldn't really be that big of a deal to just bend these out slightly and make them grippier. However, they can be a little awkward to let go of the actual head of the railroad spike when you're putting it in the forge, when there's something actually supporting the spike. It makes for a really nice niche pair of tongs that I wouldn't necessarily recommend to everybody unless you are working with railroad spikes a ton, because the bolt jaw tongs are nearly as good for using on railroad spikes, and I used a different pair for railroad spikes for a long time, and they work for other projects, which is really the biggest strength of a multi-purpose pair of tongs. Now, as I mentioned previously, I have used these tongs a number of times to make a couple of railroad spike knives, and I'm personally not the biggest fan of them. I'll show you footage here of using them on the railroad spike that we've got in the forge right now, and then I'll explain why after that. as you can see, I can put this piece fully flat on the face of the anvil. I don't need it flat right now, so I'm not going to keep it that way. Now, I don't know if you can tell at this point, but I started with my grip out here, and by the time I got done hammering, the reins are now fully touching. And that is partially because of slippage here along the jaws, partially because I need them to be tightened a little bit, and partially, mostly, because these tongs are made of a pretty low quality steel. These portions, the portions that go over the head of the railroad spike, are in fact loosening up pretty quickly over time. And that's really frustrating. And unfortunately, I've had a number of times where I've dropped a railroad spike because the jaws themselves were loosened up to the point where I ended up hanging on like this, and then an errant blow forces the jaws completely off the spike, and then you have hot steel flinging across the shop, which is really unfortunate. Now, a style of tong like this is really useful, again, if you do work with railroad spikes very frequently. However, and I don't know if you really noticed it when I was pulling the spike out of the forge, it can be a little awkward to grab the piece of steel if you don't have it perfectly face down in the forge, sitting basically like that. This is the easiest way to use them, which makes them fairly convenient, but if you're not keeping that in mind when you're putting the steel down, you might end up fumbling around with it. This is not a good way to grab it because there's actually no support there. Sideways would work if you were in a pinch, but it makes it kind of awkward. So it's such a niche pair of tongs and such a singular way to hold a railroad spike with these tongs that I would typically recommend that you go with something a little more multi-purpose as far as bang for your buck goes. Now, these tongs are usable. I'm not going to pretend that I can't use them or that they're such low quality that I can't use them for their intended purpose. They do hold railroad spikes fairly well, and it's really when you're using them for long periods of time that you really notice kind of the issues of their lower quality, so to speak. You can really tell on the weld on the little floor here of the jaw that it's just tack welded in a couple of spots. And all in all, for the money that I paid for it, I really don't think it's worth it, personally. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Ken's Custom Iron has a pair of railroad spike tong blanks that you can forge out yourself that will probably do you a lot better and won't cost you nearly $50 for a pair of tongs that are really going to bug you and you have to do doctoring on to make look better. All in all, I will continue to use these tongs because I have them now and I paid for them already. However, if you are looking for a pair of railroad spike tongs because you use railroad spikes a lot in your smithing, I would honestly look elsewhere. I would also recommend that unless you are using railroad spikes every time you go out to the shop, I would recommend sticking with a pair of bolt jaw tongs and steering clear of these altogether. All in all, I'm going to give these a 1.5 out of 5 stars, mostly because they are functional, but I had to do so much work to make them better and they cost more that I really don't think they were worth it. So the next pair of tongs that I'm going to review is this pair of wolf jaw tongs, specifically the Camu Blacksmith Tongs Wolf Jaw Blacksmithing Tool for Beginner and Professional Blacksmith, Bladesmith, and Craftsman 15-inch Amazon's Choice for $23.99. Let's check them out. All right, so before I even fire the forge back up, the first thing I've noticed here on this pair of tongs is that the jaws are slightly canted from each other, and just picking up this piece of 1/2 inch round, the center groove in each of the jaws doesn't actually line up, and it doesn't actually grab all the way back on the jaws unless you get a piece of steel perfectly lined up at a weird kind of angle from the jaws themselves. You actually get quite a bit of wiggle, which is not ideal. The alignment sideways is also not super great. Sized so that you can fit different sizes of steel sideways if you need it. I think in order to make these better, a person would need to go heat these jaws up and put something between them and forcibly align them by hammering things down and making everything kind of line up. So really unfortunate because these are a really nice looking pair of tongs and got some nice features as noted previously. But we're gonna fire the forge back up and see what we can do with this piece and see if it's really that critical that the jaws aren't perfectly aligned. So these tongs are usable. I'm able to forge a square, or at least close to a square, with them by holding them normally. But every time you turn your hand, it's only really holding the piece at one point right here at the end. And even that one point has quite a bit of wiggle to it because the jaws aren't aligned. And that's really unfortunate. Now, I forged this into a square at the other end in order to test out how it holds square stock, and there's unfortunately still quite a bit of wiggle. And that's really unfortunate because at first glance these look like a pretty nice pair of tongs, and they have a lot of features that I would include in my own pairs of tongs as I make more. Now, odds are good if you're buying a pair of tongs online, you don't want to go through the trouble of having to adjust the jaws yourself in order to make them a real operational pair of tongs. And I would generally agree with you. Now, is it the biggest deal if you've been blacksmithing for a while to have to adjust the jaws on these pair of tongs? No, not specifically. However, if you're going to buy a pair of tongs online, you should generally expect that they work out of the box. And these work. They're an operational pair of tongs, but they are far from perfect. And even for $23 to $24 for this pair, you're going to have to do some work on them in order to make them work. So in order to make them optimal, I guess, is the best way to put it. So I'm gonna give these tongs a 2.5 out of 5. I would say for the price and generally for the looks, they're pretty all right, but for the alignment of the jaws and the actual usability of them, they leave a little to be desired. And the last pair of tongs I'm going to review are the Caliburn Small V-bit Blacksmith Tongs, 14.5 inches. You can tell this, whoever the seller is actually doesn't use the keyword search that everyone else does because the title of these tongs is not a paragraph. For $39.99, let's get into it. All right, I really truly did save the best pair of tongs for last on this video. Not only does it seem like the seller on Amazon is actually maybe a real person because they didn't use all of the fancy algorithm keywords in order to sell their products. It was very simple title, but you can actually tell that this pair of tongs has quite a bit of quality packed into them. This looks like a hand-hammered rivet on both sides. The jaws themselves line up very well. There's a little bit of offset, but nothing that should affect operation. The transition from the kind of flat portion of the reins to the completely circular rounded portion of the reins is very smooth, very nice. The ball ends of the tong reins themselves are, very smooth transition, and they look like they might actually have been at least roughed in by hand before being machined. And they even have an actual touch mark on the tongs, which suggests that they were actually made by a person and not fully machined. Now, there's plenty of grind marks that's visible through the coating, mostly along the flats here, and that's kind of normal. I wouldn't necessarily think that that's a hallmark of poor quality necessarily. I do a considerable amount of filing on the reins of my tongs just to kind of smooth them out and remove any major irregularities. And I certainly don't see it as a bad thing to want to kind of make these as regular and smooth as possible, and not take as much time to really polish these out, especially when they're putting a coating on them anyway. But let's get to using them, and let's see how they feel. All right, I really, really like these tongs, and I didn't just try to foreshadow by saying I saved the best for last, but I think I really did save the best for last. I'm currently holding the round stock side of this piece of steel, and it is solid. There is no wiggle, there's no wobble. We'll switch to the square stock end that I forged down to a square, and absolutely no wiggle. That's not coming out, that's not moving. Obviously, this is going to be dependent on the size of stock that you're using these tongs with, but in the grand scheme of things, this is a fantastic pair of tongs. If we switch to holding the square stock on the side here, if we were doing some upsetting or something of that nature, still maybe a little more wiggle, and I think that's mostly because this actually has a bit of a taper to it that I forged into it. And if we do the same thing to the round stock side, it's still pretty darn secure. I'd imagine you could go up to 5/8 with these, having not actually tested them out on anything bigger than this stock, but this is really a fantastic pair of tongs. Especially for the money. Now, I know it seems like I'm talking these tongs up, especially when comparing all of the tongs that I reviewed thus far in this video, but it's really because the quality of this pair of tongs, especially for the price, $40, way outweighs the competition that I've shown in this video. For $40, this is an absolutely fantastic pair of tongs, and I strongly recommend that you go with a pair of these if you are looking for a specific pair of tongs that are multi-purpose, really nice, really high quality, and will last you a long time. I'm going to rate these tongs 5 out of 5 stars because of the quality and price that you can get these at. Honestly, I would expect these to go for way higher. If you can find a pair of these still available on Amazon, definitely go pick up a pair. Alrighty, and that is going to do it for today's video. I do sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video and got some good information to take away from it. If you think that you really enjoy the pros of all of the pairs of tongs that I reviewed in this video, or if you think that you can overcome the cons that I laid out for each pair of tongs, the link for each of those is in the description below. Not an affiliate link, I just want to provide the ability for people to go out and buy the things that I use on this channel. Maybe someday I'll search for affiliation with Amazon, but today is not that day. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, leave a comment, hit subscribe, ring that notification bell. If you want to support me in the channel further, please consider becoming an honorary striker on my Patreon. That link is in the description below the video. Or please consider becoming a member on my YouTube channel, which you can find down there as well. And as always, keep on rocking.